The smell hit him first. Always did. Jet fuel and hydraulic fluid and something else, something that lived in the metal skin of aircraft that had touched the sky. Vernon stood motionless just inside the hangar doors, security guard's hand still resting on his arm. And for a moment, he was not here at all. He was 23 years old, walking across a tarmac in Thailand. Flight suit unzipped to the waist in the brutal heat, Tommy Kerrigan matching his stride step for step. "You nervous, Spectre?" Tommy had asked, grinning that ridiculous grin of his. Vernon had shaken his head. "Just ready." That was December 1972. Operation Linebacker 2. The Christmas bombings, the newspapers would call it later. 11 days of hell over Hanoi. More surface-to-air missiles than anyone had ever seen. The sky itself turned into a killing ground. Vernon flew every night of those 11 days. Tommy flew 10. The security guard said something, but Vernon did not hear him. His eyes had found the F-4 Phantom sitting in the center of the hangar, bathed in soft light from the string bulbs overhead. Gray and weathered, her paint faded, her weapons pylons empty now. But he knew her. God help him. He knew her the way a man knows his own hands. Tail number 667463. He had climbed into that cockpit more times than he could count. He had taken her into the darkness over North Vietnam. He had brought her home when the sky was full of fire and death. "Sir," the security guard said more firmly. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Vernon nodded slowly. "Of course. I apologize for the disturbance." But he did not move. Could not move. Because looking at that aircraft, he could hear Tommy's voice in his headset as clearly as if 52 years had not passed between then and now. "Spectre, Sam launch. Sam launch. Break right, break right." Vernon had broken right. Tommy had broken left. And in the split second between those two decisions, the universe had chosen which of them would live and which would die. The missile found Tommy's aircraft at 12,000 feet. Vernon saw the flash, heard the static replace Tommy's voice mid-sentence, circled the impact site until his fuel gauges screamed at him to leave, watching for a parachute that never appeared, calling Tommy's name into a radio that would never answer. He had carried that moment for 52 years. Carried it through 836 more missions. Carried it through marriage and fatherhood and retirement and the slow fade of everything that had once given his life meaning. He carried it still, in the coordinates tattooed on his forearm, in the initials inked below them, in the date that marked the end of Tommy Kerrigan and the beginning of something hollow in Vernon's chest that never quite filled again. Eleanor had understood. That was the miracle of her, the grace that Vernon still could not fathom. She had married a man who woke screaming 3 nights a week, who flinched at car backfires, who sometimes looked through her instead of at her. She had waded through 847 missions across 3 wars, through classified absences that lasted months, through phone calls in the middle of the night that sent him to places he could never name. She had loved him anyway. She had loved him completely. And then she had gotten sick. And then she had died. And Vernon had discovered that without her, he did not know how to be a person anymore. The security guard's grip tightened on his arm. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again." Vernon looked at him. Young man, maybe 30. Serious face. Just doing his job. Vernon recognized the type, respected it even. "I flew that aircraft," Vernon said quietly. 63 missions in that specific airframe. "My name is in the logbook." The guard's expression did not change. "Sir, I understand, but you need to come with me now." Vernon could hear Preston Whitmore's voice carrying across the hangar behind him, theatrical and triumphant. "Can you believe this guy? Probably thinks he flew in World War I. Someone should check if he's wearing his pants on his head." Laughter rippled through the crowd of donors. Vernon did not turn around. He had stopped caring what men like Preston Whitmore thought of him a long time ago. He had stopped caring what anyone thought of him, really, except for one person, and she was gone. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched the photograph he kept there. Eleanor at 35, laughing at something he had said, her hair catching the light. He had taken that picture in their backyard in San Antonio, 3 days before he left for a mission he still could not discuss. She had known he might not come back. She had laughed anyway. I just wanted to see the aircraft, Vernon said, more to himself than to the guard. I just wanted to remember what it felt like. The guard's grip loosened slightly. Something in his face shifted. Look, man, I get it, but you cannot be here without an invitation. These people paid a lot of money. Vernon nodded. You are right. I apologize. He allowed himself to be led toward the exit, his eyes never leaving the F-4 Phantom. In the cockpit of his memory, Tommy Kerrigan was still alive, still grinning, still asking if he was nervous. Just ready, Vernon whispered. I was just ready. The hangar doors loomed ahead. Cold rain waited beyond them. Another night in a shelter downtown, if they had space. Another night talking to Eleanor's photograph in the dark. Another night surviving when Tommy had not, when so many had not, when the only reason Vernon Caulfield was still breathing was a split-second decision to brake right instead of left. But before he reached those doors, before he stepped back into the cold and the rain and the loneliness that had become his constant companion, Vernon heard something that made him stop. A voice behind him, different from Preston's theatrical mockery. Older, sharper, military. Wait, the voice said. Bring him back here. The security guard hesitated. Sir, I have orders to remove him from the premises. I am giving you new orders, the voice said. And there was something in it, something that Vernon recognized, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Bring him back here. Now. Vernon turned slowly. Across the hangar, pushing through the crowd of donors and socialites, came a man in his early 70s. Silver hair, cropped short, bearing that announced military before he said a word. Eyes locked on Vernon with an intensity that made Preston Whitmore step backward involuntarily. The man stopped 10 feet away, studied Vernon's face, studied his posture, studied the way he held himself, the way his weight was balanced, the way his eyes tracked movement in the room. And then the man looked at Vernon's arm, where his jacket sleeve had ridden up just slightly, exposing the edge of a tattoo. Coordinates, initials, a date. The man's face went pale. Where, he said slowly, did you get that tattoo? Vernon did not answer immediately. He looked at the man, recognized something in him, the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way his eyes moved. Pilot, Vernon thought. Fighter pilot. Someone who knows. I earned it, Vernon said quietly. December 22nd, 1972. Over Hanoi. The man's hand reached out to steady himself on a nearby table. His breathing had changed. His eyes had not left Vernon's face. What was your call sign? The man asked. And in the silence that followed, with the F-4 Phantom watching over them like a ghost from another era, Vernon straightened his spine, lifted his chin, let the soldier emerge from the old man's broken shell. Spectre, he said. The man's knees buckled. The name hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Spectre. One word. 2 syllables. And the silver-haired man in the tailored suit looked as though he had just witnessed a ghost materialize from the shadows. Preston Whitmore pushed forward through the crowd, his face flushed with irritation at the interruption to his performance. General Webb, he said, his voice carrying that practiced combination of deference and entitlement that came with inherited wealth, I apologize for this disruption. Security was just removing this individual. He clearly has some mental health issues, and I think the kindest thing we can do is get him the help he needs. General Webb did not look at Preston. His eyes remained fixed on Vernon's face, searching it, studying it, comparing it to something stored deep in his memory. Spectre, Webb repeated, barely above a whisper. From the 432nd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing. Vernon nodded slowly. And the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing before that. Yubin Royal Thai Air Force Base. 1971 to 1974. The crowd had gone quiet. Something was happening that they did not understand, some current running between these two men that made Preston Whitmore's theatrical mockery seem suddenly childish. Clara Mendez, the young reporter who had been covering the gala for the local paper, raised her phone higher. Whatever this was, she was going to capture every second of it. Preston stepped between Vernon and the general, blocking their line of sight. Sir, he said more firmly, I really must insist. This man wandered in off the street. He has been making outlandish claims about flying aircraft. He touched the catering table with his bare hands. I cannot have him disrupting our anniversary celebration. Webb looked at Preston for the first time. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes made Preston take an involuntary step backward. What claims, Webb asked quietly, has this man been making? Preston recovered his composure, gestured dismissively toward Vernon. He says he flew the F-4 Phantom. That one right there. Says he flew combat missions in Vietnam. I mean, look at him. The man is clearly delusional. Webb looked at Vernon, looked at the F-4 Phantom gleaming under the string lights. Looked back at Vernon. Tail number, Webb said. Vernon did not hesitate. 667463. McDonnell Douglas F-4E Phantom II. Delivered to the Air Force in March 1967. Assigned to the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Euban in September 1971. I flew her 63 times between October 1971 and February 1973. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Preston Whitmore had stopped talking, his mouth hanging slightly open, his brain struggling to process what he was witnessing. Webb walked past Preston without acknowledging him, stopped directly in front of Vernon. This close, Vernon could see the recognition building in the man's eyes, the pieces falling into place one by one. December 22nd, 1972, Webb said. Linebacker 2. Night mission over Hanoi. Touchip formation. Lead aircraft was call sign Spectre. Wingman was call sign Joker. Tommy Kerrigan. Vernon's jaw tightened. He did not trust himself to speak. SA-2 guideline missile, Webb continued. Detonated within 15 meters of Joker's aircraft. No ejection observed. No parachute. Lead aircraft, Spectre, remained on station for 47 minutes despite critically low fuel. Refused to leave until ordered to do so by command authority. Nearly flamed out on approach to Euban. How do you know that? Vernon asked, his voice rough. Webb's eyes were bright now. Because I studied that mission at the Air War College. Because it's taught as a case study in tactical decision-making and loyalty under fire. Because the man who flew lead that night went on to complete 847 combat missions across 3 conflicts. Because he was shot down twice and evaded capture both times. Because he developed evasion techniques that are still taught at SEER School. Because he received the Medal of Honor for actions in a mission that remains classified to this day. The crowd had drawn closer, sensing something extraordinary unfolding. Clara Mendez had moved to a better angle, her phone steady, her journalist's instincts screaming that she was witnessing the story of her career. Preston Whitmore stood frozen, his face cycling through confusion and disbelief and the first stirrings of genuine fear. Webb reached out slowly, took Vernon's arm, pushed back the sleeve of the worn tweed jacket, exposing the tattoo that Vernon had carried for 52 years. Coordinates, initials, a date, 21.0285 degrees north, Webb read aloud. 105.8542 degrees east. TK December 22nd, 1972. He looked up at Vernon's face, at the tears that had begun to slip silently down the old man's weathered cheeks. You're him, Webb said. You're actually him. Vernon could not speak. His throat had closed around something that felt like 52 years of grief trying to escape all at once. Preston Whitmore's voice cut through the moment, desperate and shrill. This is ridiculous. Anyone could have looked up those coordinates. Anyone could have gotten that tattoo. This proves nothing. Webb turned on him with such ferocity that Preston stumbled backward into a catering table, sending glasses crashing to the floor. Be quiet, Webb said, and his voice carried the command authority of 30 years in uniform. You have absolutely no idea who you've been mocking tonight. You have no idea what this man has done for this country. You have no idea what he has sacrificed. He turned back to Vernon, reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone. I'm calling some people, Webb said. People who need to know you're here. People who have been looking for you for a long time. Vernon shook his head slowly. I don't want any fuss. I just wanted to see the aircraft. I just wanted to remember. Webb gripped Vernon's shoulder, looked him directly in the eyes. With respect, sir, Webb said, and his voice cracked on the words, you don't get to disappear anymore. The Air Force has been trying to locate you for 3 years. There's a ceremony at the Pentagon that's been on hold because no one could find you. You're not a ghost, Spectre. You're a legend. And tonight, everyone in this room is going to know exactly who you are." Vernon looked past Webb to the F-4 Phantom sitting silent and patient in the center of the hangar. 63 missions in that cockpit. 63 times climbing into that seat, not knowing if he would climb back out. Tommy's voice in his headset. Eleanor's face in his heart. "I'm just an old man," Vernon said quietly. "I'm just an old man who lost everyone he ever loved." Webb shook his head. "No, sir. You're Captain Vernon Caulfield. Call sign Spectre. And by the time this night is over, everyone is going to know your name." Behind them, Preston Whitmore had begun to back toward the exit. But Clara Mendez was already moving to block his path, her phone still recording, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. No one was leaving this hangar until the truth was told. The hangar had grown still in a way that made the air feel heavy. Donors in their evening attire stood frozen with champagne flutes halfway to their lips. Servers had stopped circulating. Even the string lights overhead seemed to dim, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Vernon looked at the tattoo on his forearm, traced the coordinates with his finger the way he had done 10,000 times before. And in his mind, he was not standing in a museum in Ohio. He was sitting in a ready room in Thailand, watching Tommy Kerrigan draw a cartoon of their squadron commander on the mission briefing whiteboard. Tommy had been 24 years old, married 8 months. His wife, Sarah, was pregnant with their first child, a boy they had already decided to name Michael. Tommy kept a photograph of the ultrasound taped to his instrument panel, right where he could see it during every mission. Said it reminded him what he was fighting for. Said it reminded him to come home. They had met during flight training at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona. Vernon was quiet, methodical, precise. Tommy was loud, irreverent, fearless in a way that bordered on reckless. They should not have been friends. They should not have clicked. But something in Tommy's laughter had broken through Vernon's reserve, and by the time they earned their wings, they were inseparable. Brothers, Tommy used to say, not by blood, by something stronger. Vernon had been best man at Tommy's wedding, had held Sarah's hand when she cried about the deployment orders, had promised her, sworn to her on everything he held sacred, that he would bring Tommy home safe. And then December 22nd had come, and Vernon had broken that promise in the skies over Hanoi. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Night interdiction. Target a supply depot north of the city. Two-ship formation, Vernon as lead, Tommy as wingman. They had flown together so many times that they moved like extensions of each other, each anticipating the other's actions before they happened. The weather was clear. The approach was clean. They released their ordnance on target and banked hard for the egress route, engines screaming, countermeasures ready. And then the sky lit up. Vernon had never seen so many SAMs in one place. The North Vietnamese had concentrated their air defenses for linebacker 2, and on that night, every battery in the Hanoi area seemed to be firing at once. Missiles streaked upward like fireflies from hell, their guidance radars painting the two phantoms with invisible death. Spectre, SAM launch. Tommy's voice had crackled through the headset. Multiple launches. I count 6, no, 8 missiles tracking. Vernon had broken right. Standard evasion. Dump chaff, punch flares, dive for the deck. He had performed the maneuver 100 times. His hands moved without conscious thought, instinct taking over where thinking would be too slow. Tommy broke left. In the split second between those two decisions, fate made its choice. Vernon heard the explosion before he saw it, felt the shockwave rock his aircraft, twisted in his seat to look for Tommy's Phantom, and saw only fire. A ball of orange and black tumbling through the darkness, pieces separating, trailing smoke and flame. Joker! Vernon had screamed into his radio. Joker, eject! Eject! Tommy, get out! Static! Joker, respond! Tommy, please! Please respond! Nothing. Vernon circled the crash site for 47 minutes. His fuel gauges dropped into the red. Warning lights flashed across his instrument panel. Command authority ordered him to return to base. He ignored them, kept circling, kept calling Tommy's name. kept looking for a parachute that would never appear. When he finally landed at Euban, running on fumes and prayers, the ground crew had to pry his hands off the control stick. He had gripped it so hard that his fingers had cramped into claws. He did not speak for 3 days, did not eat, did not sleep, just sat in his quarters, staring at the wall, replaying those final seconds over and over in his mind. Break right, break left, one lived, one died, and Vernon would spend the rest of his life wondering if he had made the wrong choice. He flew the next night, and the night after, and every night until Linebacker 2 ended. Some men would have broken. Some men would have requested transfer, sought counseling, admitted that the weight had become too heavy to carry. Vernon did none of those things. He climbed into the cockpit and he flew because that was what Tommy would have wanted. Because stopping meant admitting that Tommy was really gone. Because as long as Vernon kept flying, some part of Tommy flew with him. 847 missions, 3 wars, shot down twice over Laos and once over Iraq, evaded capture in jungles and deserts, received medals he never looked at, commendations he never read, recognition he never sought. All of it was penance. All of it was apology. All of it was Vernon trying to earn the life that should have been Tommy's. And then Eleanor got sick. And then Eleanor died. And Vernon discovered that without her, without the one person who had understood why he could not stop flying, why he could not stop fighting, why he could not stop trying to repay a debt that could never be repaid, he had no idea how to exist in the world. He sold the house, gave the money to their daughter Rebecca, who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn silence, told her he needed to travel, told her he would call, and then he walked away from everything and everyone because the grief was too heavy and he did not want to burden anyone else with its weight. 3 years of wandering, 3 years of shelters and park benches and the kindness of strangers, 3 years of talking to Eleanor's photograph in the dark, telling her about the places he had been, the aircraft he had seen, the memories that would not let him rest. And now he stood in a museum in Ohio, surrounded by people who had no idea what he had done or what he had lost, with a general gripping his shoulder and tears streaming down his face, and Tommy Kerrigan's initials burning on his arm like a brand that would never fade. Still here, brother, Vernon whispered. Still flying. General Webb heard him, understood him, tightened his grip on Vernon's shoulder. He's still with you, Webb said quietly. Every mission you flew after that night, he was with you. Vernon nodded, could not speak, could not explain that Tommy was always with him. In the coordinates on his arm, in the empty seat beside him, in the dreams that came every night, filled with fire and static and the sound of his own voice screaming a name into a radio that would never answer. The F-4 Phantom sat silent in the center of the hangar, waiting, patient, a witness to everything Vernon had been and everything he had lost. And somewhere in the crowd, Preston Whitmore was beginning to understand that he had made the worst mistake of his life. General Webb released Vernon's shoulder and turned to face the crowd. His posture had shifted, his bearing now fully military, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded thousands. I need everyone's attention, Webb said. What is happening here tonight is not a disruption. It is not a misunderstanding. It is a moment that some of you will remember for the rest of your lives. Preston Whitmore had retreated to the edge of the crowd, his face pale, his expensive blazer stained with champagne from the glasses he had knocked over. His father, Preston Whitmore III, had materialized beside him, a silver-haired man with the same entitled bearing, now watching the proceedings with growing unease. The museum director, Helen Ashworth, stepped forward. Her earlier embarrassment had transformed into something more complex, a mixture of confusion and dawning horror at what she might have allowed to happen under her watch. General Webb, she said carefully, perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private. If this gentleman has legitimate credentials, we can certainly verify them through proper channels. Webb shook his head. No, this happens here. This happens now, in front of everyone who watched this man be humiliated for the crime of telling the truth. He turned back to Vernon, who stood motionless beside the F-4 Phantom, his weathered face still wet with tears he had not bothered to wipe away. Captain Caulfield, Webb said formally, "I apologize for what you have experienced tonight. I apologize on behalf of everyone in this room who stood by and watched while you were mocked and degraded. What happened here was a disgrace." Vernon shook his head slowly. "There is no need for apology. I understand how I appear. I understand why they doubted." Webb's jaw tightened. "That is precisely the problem, sir. You should not have to prove your service to anyone. You should not have to justify your presence. You gave more to this country than anyone in this room will ever understand, and you were treated like a criminal for it." Preston Whitmore's father stepped forward, his political instincts clearly screaming that damage control was needed. "General Webb," he said smoothly, "if there has been some misunderstanding, I'm certain my son would be happy to apologize. Preston is passionate about aviation history, and sometimes that passion can come across as overzealous." Webb turned to face the elder Whitmore with an expression that made the wealthy donor take a step backward. "Your son," Webb said quietly, "accused a Medal of Honor recipient of stolen valor. Your son physically blocked a combat veteran from leaving a building. Your son snatched a photograph of this man's deceased wife from his hands and waved it around for the amusement of your friends. This is not a misunderstanding, Mr. Whitmore. This is a catastrophe." The crowd had drawn closer still, phones raised, recording everything. Clara Mendez had moved to a position near the F-4 Phantom, her camera capturing both Vernon's face and the reactions of the Whitmore family. She understood that she was witnessing something that would spread far beyond this small Ohio town. Helen Ashworth approached Vernon with trembling hands. "Sir," she said, her voice cracking, "I am so deeply sorry. When security called me, I should have asked more questions. I should have listened. Instead, I assumed the worst and I was wrong." Vernon looked at her with those gray-blue eyes that had seen so much death and loss. "You were trying to protect your event," he said gently. "I hold no grudge against you." Ashworth's composure broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She reached out and took Vernon's hand in both of hers. "No," she said. "No, that is not good enough. You walked through those doors on a cold night, probably just looking for warmth and a chance to see these beautiful aircraft, and we treated you like a threat. We treated you like you did not matter. And all this time, you were one of the greatest pilots this country has ever produced." Vernon said nothing. His eyes had drifted back to the F-4 Phantom, to the tail number he knew by heart, to the cockpit where he had spent so many hours with Tommy's voice in his ear and Eleanor's face in his heart. Webb was speaking into his phone now, his voice low and urgent. "I need you to pull everything on Captain Vernon Caulfield, call sign Spectre, 432nd TRW, 8th TFW, and the classified files from 1986 through 1991. Yes, I know they're classified. I'm telling you who I am, and I'm telling you this is an emergency. This man is standing in front of me right now, and he needs to be verified immediately." The younger Preston Whitmore had begun edging toward the exit, but his father grabbed his arm and held him in place. The elder Whitmore understood that leaving now would only make things worse. The cameras were rolling. The witnesses were watching. The only path forward was through. "Captain Caulfield," the elder Whitmore said, stepping forward with his hand extended, "I want to personally apologize for my son's behavior. Whatever he said, whatever he did, it does not reflect the values of our family or our commitment to honoring those who have served." Vernon looked at the extended hand, looked at the man offering it, looked at Preston cowering behind his father like a child caught in a lie. "Your son called me a liar," Vernon said quietly. "He said I was delusional. He said I should be removed from the premises and given mental health treatment. He took a photograph of my wife from my pocket and held it up for everyone to laugh at." The elder Whitmore's hand wavered. His political smile flickered. "He did all of that," Vernon continued, "because I am old and I am poor and I do not look like what he thinks a hero should look like. He did all of that because it is easier to mock than to ask questions. It is easier to assume the worst than to consider that you might be wrong." Vernon reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the photograph of Eleanor that Preston had snatched from him earlier, looked at her face for a long moment, his thumb tracing the edge of the worn paper. "My wife waited for me through 847 missions," Vernon said. "She raised our daughter alone for months at a time, while I was in places I could not name, doing things I could not discuss. She never complained. She never wavered. And when she died, I lost the only person in the world who truly knew me. He looked up at the elder Whitmore, then at Preston, then at the crowd of wealthy donors who had laughed at his humiliation. I did not come here tonight for recognition. I did not come here to prove anything to anyone. I came here because I am an old man who misses his wife and his friends and the life he used to have. I came here because that aircraft was the closest thing to home I have left. His voice broke on the last word. He turned away from the Whitmores and walked slowly toward the F-4 Phantom, his hand reaching out to touch her wing, his fingers tracing the faded paint like a man greeting an old friend. Behind him, General Webb ended his call. His face had changed. Whatever he had learned, whatever had been confirmed, it had shaken him to his core. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb said, his voice carrying across the silent hangar, "I have just received confirmation from the Pentagon. The man standing before you is indeed Captain Vernon Caulfield, United States Air Force, retired. His service record is beyond classified. His decorations include the Medal of Honor, the Air Force Cross, 3 Silver Stars, and the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor Device and 4 oak leaf clusters." The crowd stood frozen. "And that," Webb said quietly, "is only what I am allowed to tell you." The silence that followed Webb's words was so complete that Vernon could hear the rain pattering against the hangar roof 40 feet above. Medal of Honor. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, pressing down on everyone who heard them. Preston Whitmore had gone white. Not pale. White. The color of fresh paper. The color of bone. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his brain unable to process what he had just heard. His father stood beside him, equally stunned, the political calculations behind his eyes grinding to a halt. Helen Ashworth covered her mouth with both hands. Tears streamed openly down her face. Around her, donors and patrons and aviation enthusiasts stood frozen in various states of shock, their champagne flutes forgotten, their evening plans suddenly irrelevant. Clara Mendez lowered her phone for just a moment, staring at Vernon's back as he stood with his hand on the F-4's wing. Then she raised it again, her journalist's instincts overriding her personal astonishment. This story would be on the national news by morning. This story might define her career. Vernon did not turn around. He kept his hand on the aircraft's wing, feeling the cold metal beneath his palm, remembering how it had felt warm from the Thailand sun, remembering the vibration of the engines at full afterburner, remembering Tommy's voice crackling through the static. "You were right over there, Spectre. Always Joker. Just admiring the view." "What view?" "It is pitch black out here." "Exactly. Best view in the world when nobody is shooting at you." Webb approached slowly, as though approaching a wild animal that might startle and run. He stopped a few feet away, waiting for Vernon to acknowledge him. "Captain Caulfield," Webb said softly. "Sir, the Pentagon is sending verification documents. They will arrive within the hour. Your service record, your decorations, your photograph from 1972. Everything." Vernon nodded without turning. "That is not necessary. Sir, with respect, it is necessary. These people need to understand what they witnessed tonight. They need to understand who you are." Vernon finally turned. His eyes were dry now, but the tracks of his earlier tears still marked his weathered cheeks. His posture had changed in some subtle way, straightening, squaring, the pilot emerging from the vagrant shell. "Who I am," Vernon said quietly, "is an old man who outlived everyone he loved. Who I am is a husband without a wife, a father who abandoned his daughter, a wingman who came home alone. All those decorations, all those missions, they do not change that." Webb shook his head. "They do not erase your pain, sir. But they matter. They matter because a boy in this room tonight might be thinking about military service. They matter because a veteran in this crowd might be struggling and need to see that heroes can fall and still deserve respect. They matter because men like Preston Whitmore need to learn that the people they dismiss, the people they mock, might have given more than they could ever imagine." Vernon looked past Webb to where Preston stood frozen beside his father. The younger man's arrogance had evaporated completely, replaced by something that looked very much like terror. "He is young," Vernon said. He does not understand what he has done. Webb's expression hardened. He is old enough to know better. He is old enough to face consequences. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone had pulled up something on their phone. Then another person. Then another. Vernon's name spreading through search engines, his photograph from 50 years ago appearing on screens, the fragments of his declassified service record emerging from military databases. "Oh my God," a woman's voice said from somewhere in the crowd. "He shot down 7 aircraft. 7 confirmed kills." Another voice. "It says here he was captured in Laos in 1973 and escaped after 11 days. Another. "There's a whole section about something called Operation Nightfall, but it is completely redacted." Webb turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying easily through the hangar. "What you're finding online is only the beginning. Captain Caulfield's service extended well beyond Vietnam. He flew combat missions in Grenada, Panama, and the Gulf War. He was recalled from retirement 3 times because there were missions only he could fly. There are operations in his file that will not be declassified for another 40 years. Vernon closed his eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The missions, the years, the friends he had buried, the enemies he had made, the secrets he would carry to his grave. When he opened his eyes, he found himself looking at the cockpit of the F-4 Phantom, the same seat he had occupied on 63 missions, the same instruments he had watched through endless nights over hostile territory, the same canopy that had protected him from everything except his own memories. "I flew her the night Tommy died," Vernon said, his voice barely audible. "This exact aircraft. When I landed at Euban, my crew chief told me there was shrapnel damage to the left engine nacelle. A piece of Tommy's Phantom had embedded itself in my aircraft. He kept flying with me even after he was gone." Webb bowed his head. The crowd stood silent. "I asked them to save that piece of shrapnel," Vernon continued. "It is supposed to be in the Air Force Museum in Dayton. A fragment of an F-4 Phantom, catalog number 19730-847. I have never gone to see it. I have never been able to bring myself to visit." An older man near the back of the crowd spoke up. His voice was rough, his posture suggesting military bearing long ingrained. "I have seen it," the man said. "I am a volunteer docent at the museum. It is in the Vietnam collection. There is a placard that explains the story. It mentions a pilot named Spectre who recovered it." Vernon looked at him, saw the recognition in the old volunteer's eyes, saw the slight nod of understanding that passed between veterans who had seen things civilians could never comprehend. Then the older man did something that made the air catch in Vernon's throat. He straightened his spine, squared his shoulders, and raised his right hand in a slow, deliberate salute. One by one, other veterans in the crowd followed. An elderly man in a wheelchair, a middle-aged woman with close-cropped hair, a young man barely out of his 20s with the unmistakable bearing of active duty, hands rising throughout the hangar, saluting a man they had never met but somehow already knew. Vernon stood at attention beside the F-4 Phantom, his hand rising to return the salute, his eyes filling with tears that he no longer tried to hide. And in the crowd, Preston Whitmore watched it all unfold, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done. Vernon held the salute for a long moment before lowering his hand. The veterans in the crowd followed suit, their arms dropping slowly, their eyes never leaving him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of respect, full of recognition, full of something Vernon had not felt in 3 years. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Eleanor's photograph, looked at her face, traced the curve of her smile with his thumb. "They see me now, sweetheart," he whispered. "After all this time, they finally see me." Webb approached again, his phone still in his hand. "Sir, the verification documents are being transmitted now. Director Ashworth has offered to display them on the museum's presentation screens. Your official service photograph, your decoration citations, your flight records. Everything the Pentagon is willing to release." Vernon shook his head slowly. "I did not come here for a ceremony, General. I came here because I was cold and tired and I saw the lights through the windows. I came here because that aircraft is the only thing left in this world that knows who I used to be." Webb nodded. "I understand that, sir. But what happened tonight cannot be undone. Preston Whitmore publicly humiliated you. He accused you of stolen valor. He treated you like a criminal. If we let this moment pass without setting the record straight, his version of events becomes the story. Is that what you want? Vernon looked across the hangar to where Preston stood beside his father. The young man had aged 10 years in the last 20 minutes. His designer blazer hung limp on his shoulders. His carefully styled hair had fallen across his forehead. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal searching for escape. Part of Vernon wanted to let it go. Part of him wanted to slip out the side door and disappear into the rain and continue his wandering as though none of this had happened. That was the easier path. That was the path that required nothing of him except continued survival. But then he thought of Tommy. Tommy who had never gotten the chance to grow old. Tommy whose son Michael had grown up without a father. Tommy who had died in a split second of fire and chaos while Vernon broke right and lived. And he thought of Eleanor. Eleanor who had spent 43 years as a military wife, never complaining, never wavering, always waiting. Eleanor who had held his hand through the nightmares and the silences and the long deployments that took him to places she could never know. Eleanor who had deserved so much better than a husband who ran away when she needed him most. Vernon straightened his spine, squared his shoulders. Let the pilot emerge fully from the shell of the vagrant. Show them, he said quietly. Show them everything. Webb nodded once, pulled out his phone, made a call that lasted less than 30 seconds. Then he walked to the museum's control station and spoke with a young technician who nodded rapidly and began typing commands. The lights in the hangar dimmed slightly. A large screen descended from the ceiling at the far end of the space, positioned so that everyone could see it clearly. The museum's sound system crackled to life. And then Vernon's face appeared on the screen. Not the weathered, worn face of the man standing beside the F-4 Phantom. The face of a young captain in his dress blues, 26 years old, eyes sharp and clear, the silver wings of a pilot gleaming on his chest. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same gray-blue eyes, the same set of the jaw, the same quiet intensity that suggested depths far beyond what the surface revealed. Captain Vernon Elijah Caulfield, a computerized voice announced as text scrolled beside the photograph. United States Air Force. Service dates: March 1968 through February 1995. Primary aircraft: F-4 Phantom II, F-15 Eagle, F-117 Nighthawk. The screen changed. A list of decorations appeared, each one accompanied by its distinctive ribbon. Medal of Honor, the voice continued. Awarded for actions on classified date in classified location. Citation remains sealed by order of the President of the United States. Another gasp from the crowd. Medal of Honor recipients were rare. Medal of Honor recipients whose citations remained classified were almost unheard of. Air Force Cross. Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters. Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor Device and 4 oak leaf clusters. Bronze Star with Valor Device. Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster. Prisoner of War Medal. The list continued. Combat Action Medal. Air Medal with silver oak leaf cluster representing 5 awards. Vietnam Service Medal. Southwest Asia Service Medal. The screen filled with ribbons, each representing missions flown, sacrifices made, moments when Vernon Caulfield had put his life on the line for his country. Total combat missions: 847, the voice announced. Confirmed aerial victories: 7. Combat ejections: 2. Days in enemy captivity: 11. Successful evasions: 3. Vernon watched the screen without expression. These were just numbers, just statistics. They did not capture the terror of a SAM launch in the darkness. They did not convey the loneliness of a cockpit at 40,000 feet. They did not explain the weight of watching friends die and somehow continuing to fly. But the crowd did not know that. The crowd saw the numbers and the decorations and the photograph of a young warrior, and they understood that the man they had watched being humiliated was something far beyond their comprehension. Helen Ashworth was openly sobbing now. Several donors had turned away, unable to meet Vernon's eyes. The veterans in the crowd stood at attention, their faces carved from stone. And Preston Whitmore had fallen to his knees. Not dramatically, not theatrically. His legs had simply given out beneath him, unable to support the weight of what he was witnessing. He knelt on the polished hangar floor, his hands limp at his sides, his face a mask of horror and shame. His father reached down to pull him up, but Preston shook his head, stayed on his knees, stared at the screen as the evidence of Vernon's service continued to scroll past. "I did not know," Preston whispered. "I did not know." But that was precisely the point. He had not bothered to know. He had not bothered to ask. He had seen an old man in worn clothes and assumed the worst. And now the truth was destroying him one decoration at a time. Vernon turned away from the screen. He did not need to watch. He had lived it. Instead, he looked at the F-4 Phantom beside him, reached out and placed his palm flat against her fuselage, felt the cold metal that had once been warm with life. "We did it, Tommy," he whispered. "After all these years, they finally know." The screen continued to display Vernon's service record, but no one was looking at it anymore. Every eye in the hangar was fixed on the old man standing beside the F-4 Phantom, his hands still resting on her fuselage, his profile lit by the soft glow of the string lights overhead. General Webb stepped forward, his voice carrying through the silence. "There is more," he said. "Things that are not in the official record. Things that only a handful of people know." Vernon turned to look at him. "What are you doing, General?" Webb met his eyes steadily. "What should have been done years ago, sir? Telling the truth." He addressed the crowd, his posture formal, his voice taking on the cadence of an official briefing. "In 1986, Captain Caulfield was recruited for a program that does not officially exist. He flew missions in aircraft that were not acknowledged to be operational. He went to places that the United States government still denies any involvement in. I cannot tell you the details. I cannot even tell you the names of the operations. But I can tell you this. There are people alive today, thousands of them, who owe their lives to this man. And none of them will ever know his name." Vernon's jaw tightened. "That is enough, General." Webb shook his head. "No, sir, it is not. Because in 1991, during the Gulf War, you flew a mission that changed the course of the conflict. You destroyed a target that would have killed hundreds of American soldiers. You did it alone. You did it at night. And you did it knowing that if anything went wrong, your country would deny you ever existed." The crowd stood transfixed. Even Clara Mendez had lowered her phone, listening with her mouth slightly open. "You were shot down on the egress," Webb continued. "You ejected over enemy territory. You evaded capture for 6 days with a broken collarbone and 3 cracked ribs. You walked 47 miles through the desert to reach friendly lines. And when you finally made it back, do you know what you did?" Vernon said nothing. His hand had tightened on the aircraft's fuselage. "You asked for another aircraft," Webb said. "You asked to go back up, because there were still targets that needed to be destroyed and pilots who needed leadership. You flew 11 more missions before the war ended. 11 more missions with a broken collarbone that you hid from the flight surgeons." A woman in the crowd let out a sob. An elderly man removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. The weight of what they were hearing pressed down on everyone in the hangar. Preston Whitmore remained on his knees. His father had stopped trying to lift him. The elder Whitmore stood frozen, his face ashen, his political calculations shattered beyond repair. Webb walked closer to Vernon, stopping just a few feet away. His voice dropped, but in the absolute silence of the hangar, every word carried. "I studied you at the War College," he said. "I wrote my thesis on your tactical innovations. I have spent my entire career trying to live up to the standard you set. And when I saw you standing here tonight, being mocked by a man who has never sacrificed anything for anyone, I knew I could not let it stand." Vernon looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You were a good student, General. I remember your paper. You understood things that most people miss." Webb's composure cracked. "You remember?" "Sir, that was 30 years ago." "You read my thesis?" Vernon almost smiled. "I read every paper written about my missions. Most of them got it wrong. Yours did not. I always wondered what happened to that young major who understood what it meant to fly alone in the dark. Webb blinked rapidly, swallowed hard. For a moment, the decorated general looked like a young officer again, receiving praise from a hero he had worshipped from afar. Then Vernon turned to face the crowd. The movement was slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of 78 years and 847 missions and more loss than any single person should have to bear. "I did not do any of this for recognition," Vernon said, his voice quiet but clear. "I did not do it for medals or citations or my name on a wall. I did it because it was my duty. I did it because there were people counting on me. I did it because my wingman died in the skies over Hanoi, and I owed it to him to keep flying until I could not fly anymore." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his dog tags. The metal was worn smooth, the engraving barely visible. But beside his own tags hung another set, older, more battered, stained with something dark that might have been blood or might have been 50 years of being carried close to a broken heart. "These belong to Tommy Kerrigan," Vernon said, holding up the second set of tags. "His wife Sarah gave them to me at his memorial service. She told me to carry them until I could give them back to him myself." He looked at the tags for a long moment. "I have carried them for 52 years. Through every mission, through every deployment, through every night when I woke up screaming his name. I carried them when I married Eleanor. I carried them when my daughter was born. I carried them when I buried my wife and walked away from everything I had left." His voice broke slightly on the last words, but he steadied himself and continued. "I'm not a hero. Tommy was the hero. He was braver than me, funnier than me, better than me in every way that mattered. He should have been the one to come home. He should have been the one to grow old. But he did not, and I have spent every day since then trying to be worthy of the life he did not get to live." The hangar was absolutely silent. Not a cough, not a whisper, not a single shuffled foot. Every person present understood that they were witnessing something sacred. Vernon turned back to the F-4 Phantom, pressed his forehead against her cool metal skin, closed his eyes. "I'm tired, Tommy," he whispered. "I am so tired, but I'm still here, still trying, just like I promised." Behind him, one by one, the people in the crowd began to weep. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Not the shuffling of the crowd. Something more deliberate, more purposeful. The sharp click of heels on polished concrete. Vernon lifted his head from the aircraft's fuselage and turned toward the sound. A woman was pushing through the crowd. Mid-40s. Dark hair streaked with early gray. Eyes the same shade of gray-blue that looked back at Vernon from every mirror. She wore a simple black dress and a string of pearls that Vernon recognized immediately. Eleanor had worn those pearls on their wedding day. The crowd parted before her like water before a ship's prow. She walked with the determined stride of someone who had been searching for a very long time and had finally found what she was looking for. Vernon's breath caught in his throat. "Rebecca," he whispered. His daughter stopped 10 feet away. Her face was a battlefield of emotions. Anger and relief and grief and love warring for dominance behind those familiar eyes. 3 years, she said. Her voice was steady, but Vernon could hear the tremor beneath it. 3 years, Dad. I have been looking for you for 3 years. Vernon could not speak, could not move. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times during his wandering, had rehearsed what he would say, had prepared explanations and apologies and justifications. But now, faced with his daughter's eyes, every word evaporated from his mind. Rebecca took another step forward. I hired private investigators. I contacted every VA hospital in the country. I called homeless shelters from Maine to California. I put up flyers. I ran social media campaigns. I never stopped looking. Not for one single day. Vernon's legs felt weak beneath him. He reached out to steady himself against the F-4's wing. How he managed. How did you find me? Rebecca held up her phone. The screen showed a notification. A breaking news alert from a local Ohio newspaper. Her daughter's name, Clara Mendez, in the byline. I got a call 20 minutes ago, Rebecca said, from a reporter who recognized your name. She said you were in a museum. She said someone had been mocking you. She said I needed to come right away. Vernon looked past his daughter to where Clara Mendez stood with her phone still raised. The young reporter gave him a small nod. She had not just been documenting the story. She had been tracking down his family. I did not want to be found, Vernon said quietly. I did not want to burden you with my grief. Rebecca's composure shattered. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but her voice grew stronger, fiercer. Burden me? Dad, you were my father. When Mom died, I lost her. But I did not have to lose you too. You chose to leave. You chose to disappear. You chose to let me think you might be dead in a ditch somewhere while I raised my children and buried my grief and tried to pretend that everything was fine. Vernon bowed his head. I know, Rebecca. There is no excuse. There is no justification. I was broken, and I did not know how to be fixed, and I thought the kindest thing I could do was remove myself from your life. The kindest thing? Rebecca's voice rose. The kindest thing would have been letting me help you. The kindest thing would have been trusting me enough to lean on me. The kindest thing would have been remembering that you are not the only one who loved her. She was crying openly now. The crowd watched in silence, bearing witness to a reunion that was equal parts joy and pain. Vernon took a shaky step toward his daughter, then another. His worn loafers scraped against the polished floor. His hands trembled at his sides. I see her in your face, he said softly. Every time I looked at you after she died, I saw Eleanor. And it hurt so much that I could not breathe. I thought if I stayed, my grief would poison you. I thought if I left, you could move on. You could be happy. Rebecca closed the remaining distance between them, stood directly in front of her father, close enough to touch. I was never going to be happy without you, she said. You and Mom were my whole world. When she died, I needed you more than ever. And you vanished. Vernon reached up with a trembling hand, touched his daughter's cheek, felt the warmth of her skin beneath his weathered fingers. I am sorry, he whispered. I am so sorry, Rebecca. I failed you. I failed your mother. I have spent 3 years trying to disappear, and all I did was cause more pain. Rebecca grabbed his hand, held it against her cheek. Her tears ran over his fingers. I do not want an apology, she said. I want my father back. My children want their grandfather. We have a room ready for you. We have had it ready for 3 years. We never gave up. We never stopped waiting. Vernon's legs finally gave out. He sank to his knees on the hangar floor, still holding his daughter's hand, 52 years of grief and guilt pouring out of him in great racking sobs. Rebecca knelt beside him, wrapped her arms around him, held him the way Eleanor used to hold him after the nightmares, tight and warm and unrelenting. I have you, she whispered. I have you, Dad. You're not alone anymore. The crowd stood frozen, watching the reunion unfold. Helen Ashworth wept openly. General Webb stood at attention, his eyes bright with unshed tears. The veterans in the room remained still, honoring the moment with their silence. And on his knees in the shadow of the F-4 Phantom, surrounded by the ghosts of everyone he had ever loved and lost, Vernon Caulfield finally stopped running. She found me. Eleanor, he whispered into his daughter's shoulder. Our little girl found me. Rebecca held him tighter, and she is never letting go again. Father and daughter remained on the hangar floor for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the world around them fading into insignificance. Vernon breathed in the scent of his daughter's hair, something floral and familiar that reminded him of Eleanor's garden in San Antonio. The garden he had helped plant. The garden he had abandoned along with everything else. Rebecca finally pulled back, her hands still gripping her father's shoulders as though afraid he might vanish again if she let go. You are coming home with me tonight, she said. It was not a question. Vernon nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. General Webb approached slowly, his footsteps measured and respectful. He stopped a few feet away and waited until Rebecca looked up at him. Ma'am, Webb said quietly, I am General Marcus Webb, United States Air Force, retired. Your father is one of the most decorated combat pilots in American history. I want you to know that the Air Force has been searching for him as well. There are ceremonies that have been postponed, recognition that is long overdue. Rebecca studied Webb for a moment. Then she looked back at her father's weathered face. Recognition can wait, she said firmly. Right now, my father needs rest. He needs food. He needs his family. Everything else comes later. Webb nodded. Of course. But when he is ready, when you are both ready, there are people who want to honor him properly. The Pentagon, the president, the men and women who served with him and under him. He matters to a great many people. Vernon looked up at Webb. His eyes were red, his face streaked with tears, but something in his expression had changed. The hollow emptiness that had lived there for 3 years had begun to fill with something else, something that looked almost like hope. Thank you, General, Vernon said, for everything you did tonight, for remembering. Webb straightened to attention. Rendered a Christ salute. It was my honor, sir. It will always be my honor. Vernon struggled to his feet, Rebecca helping him rise. His legs were unsteady, his body exhausted from the emotional weight of the evening. But he stood straight, squared his shoulders, returned Webb's salute with the precision of a man who had done it 10,000 times before. When both men lowered their hands, Webb stepped back and addressed the crowd. I think we have all witnessed something extraordinary tonight, he said. A hero revealed, a family reunited, a reminder that the people we dismiss, the people we overlook, might be carrying burdens and histories beyond our imagination. He turned to look at Preston Whitmore, who remained on his knees near the back of the crowd. The young man had not moved, had not spoken. His father stood beside him, face gray, hands hanging uselessly at his sides. Mr. Whitmore, Webb said, and his voice carried an edge of steel. I expect you will want to make a formal apology, but that can wait for another time. Right now, I suggest you go home and think very carefully about who you are and who you want to become. Tonight could be the worst moment of your life, or it could be the moment that changes everything. That choice is yours. Preston looked up. His eyes were red. His face was wet with tears that had nothing to do with performance. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply nodded, a broken movement that contained something that might have been the beginning of genuine remorse. Helen Ashworth stepped forward, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Captain Caulfield, she said, I know you want to leave with your daughter tonight. But before you go, I need to show you something. Please, it will only take a moment. Vernon looked at Rebecca. She nodded slightly. Ashworth led them across the hangar to the F-4 Phantom. She stopped beside a glass display case mounted on a pedestal near the aircraft's nose. Inside the case was a leather-bound book, open to a page filled with handwritten entries. This is the original flight log for this aircraft, Ashworth said. We recovered it when we acquired the Phantom in 1998. It documents every mission she ever flew. She gestured to one of her staff members, who carefully opened the case and turned several pages in the book. There, Ashworth said softly, December 22nd, 1972. Mission 847. Vernon leaned forward. His eyes found the entry. His own handwriting, faded but still legible after 52 years. Night interdiction. Hanoi Sector. Touchip Formation. Led Caulfield. Wing. Kerrigan. Mission successful. Wingman lost to Samfire. No ejection observed. Below the entry, in a different hand, someone had added a note. Pilot remained on station 47 minutes past bingo fuel. Returned with less than 200 pounds remaining. Aircraft sustained shrapnel damage to left nacelle. Fragment recovered and preserved. Vernon traced the words with his finger. His own handwriting from half a century ago. The record of the worst night of his life, preserved in ink and leather and glass. We did not know, Ashworth said quietly. When we put this display together, we had no idea who Caulfield was. We had no idea the pilot who flew this aircraft was still alive. But now we know, and if you will allow it, we would like to update this display. We would like to tell your story. Tommy's story. The real story. Vernon stood silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the dog tags. His own tags and Tommy's, intertwined after 52 years. If you tell the story, he said quietly, make sure you tell it right. Make sure people know that Tommy Kerrigan was the bravest man I ever knew. Make sure they know he died protecting his country. Make sure they know he had a son he never got to meet. He paused, swallowed hard. His name was Michael Dumieson. He became a pilot too. Flew F-16s out of Nellis for 12 years. I tracked his career from a distance. Never reached out. Never told him who I was. But I watched. I made sure he was okay. Rebecca squeezed her father's arm. You kept watch over him, just like you kept watch over everyone. Vernon shook his head. I could not save his father. Watching over him was the least I could do. He looked at the flight log one more time. Then he stepped back and turned to face his daughter. Take me home, Rebecca. I am ready to come home. She slipped her arm through his and led him toward the hangar doors. The crowd parted silently before them. Phones lowered, voices hushed. Veterans saluted as they passed. Civilians bowed their heads. And as Vernon Caulfield walked out of the Hartwell Aviation Heritage Museum with his daughter at his side, the F-4 Phantom sat silent and patient in the soft light. Her service finally complete, her pilot finally going home. The rain had stopped by the time they stepped outside. The October air was cold and clean, carrying the smell of wet pavement and fallen leaves. Vernon breathed deeply, filling his lungs with something that felt almost like freedom. Rebecca's car was parked near the entrance, a sensible sedan with a child's booster seat visible in the back. Evidence of the life she had built while he was wandering. Evidence of the grandchildren he had never met. Vernon stopped beside the passenger door, looked at his daughter in the glow of the parking lot lights. How many, he asked quietly, how many grandchildren do I have? Rebecca's face softened. 2. Emma is 7. Jacob is 4. They know all about you, Dad. I show them pictures. I tell them stories. They have been waiting to meet you for as long as they can remember. Vernon closed his eyes. 7 and 4. He had missed 7 years of Emma's life. For years of Jacob's. First steps. First words. Birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons. All of it gone. All of it stolen by his own cowardice. I do not deserve them, he said. Rebecca opened the car door and guided him into the passenger seat. Then she walked around to the driver's side, climbed in, and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. You know what Mom used to say about deserving things? Rebecca asked. Vernon shook his head. She said that love is not about deserving. Love is about showing up, day after day, even when it is hard, even when you are broken, even when you think you have nothing left to give. You just keep showing up. Vernon stared through the windshield at the museum building. Through the glass walls, he could see the crowd beginning to disperse. Could see General Webb shaking hands with Helen Ashworth. Could see Preston Whitmore being led out a side exit by his father, shoulders hunched, head bowed. I stopped showing up, Vernon said. After your mother died, I stopped showing up for you. For myself. For everyone. Rebecca reached over and took his hand. You're showing up now. That is what matters. That is all that has ever mattered. She started the car, pulled out of the parking lot. The museum receded in the rearview mirror, its lights growing smaller until they disappeared around a curve in the road. They drove in silence for several miles. Vernon watched the dark Ohio countryside roll past, farmhouses and barns and fields stripped bare for winter. A landscape utterly unlike the jungles of Vietnam or the deserts of Iraq. A landscape at peace. Rebecca spoke without taking her eyes off the road. Clara Mendez called me from inside the museum. She told me what happened, what Preston Whitmore did, what you said. Vernon nodded slowly. She asked if she could interview you for a longer piece. She said your story needs to be told. Vernon considered this. His instinct was to refuse. He had spent his entire life avoiding attention, deflecting recognition, disappearing into the shadows. But something had shifted inside him tonight. Something had cracked open that he could not close again. Maybe, he said finally, maybe someday, but not yet. Not until I have met my grandchildren. Not until I have started to become their grandfather instead of just a stranger with their blood. Rebecca smiled. The first real smile he had seen from her all evening. That is exactly what Mom would have said. They drove on. The miles passed. Vernon felt exhaustion settling into his bones, deeper than anything physical. The exhaustion of 52 years of running. The exhaustion of 3 years of hiding. The exhaustion of a single evening that had torn down every wall he had ever built. Rebecca, he said softly, I need you to understand something. She glanced at him. What is it, Dad? I am not fixed. One night does not undo 3 years of wandering. It does not undo the things I saw or the things I did or the friends I lost. I'm going to have nightmares. I'm going to have bad days. There will be mornings when I cannot get out of bed and evenings when I cannot stop crying. I am broken in ways that might never heal completely. Rebecca nodded. I know. And you still wanted to come home? She reached over and squeezed his hand again. Dad, I'm a military daughter. I grew up watching you leave and wondering if you would come back. I learned to live with uncertainty before I learned to ride a bike. I know what broken looks like. I know what healing looks like. And I know that neither of them happen alone. Vernon felt tears sliding down his cheeks again. He did not wipe them away. Your mother was right about you, he said. She always said you were the strongest person in our family. Stronger than her. Stronger than me. I did not believe her. But she was right. Rebecca's eyes glistened. She taught me how to be strong. And so did you. They pulled off the highway onto a smaller road. Then onto a residential street lined with trees whose leaves had turned gold and crimson. Rebecca slowed the car and turned into the driveway of a modest 2-story house with a wraparound porch and a swing hanging near the front door. Lights glowed in the windows. A shadow moved behind the curtains. David is waiting up, Rebecca said. My husband. He wanted to meet you the moment we got home. Vernon looked at the house, at the warm light spilling through the windows, at the life his daughter had built without him. Does he know, Vernon asked, about tonight? About what happened? Rebecca nodded. I call him on the way to the museum. He knows everything, and he cannot wait to shake your hand. The front door opened. A man stepped onto the porch. Tall, steady, the kind of presence that suggested reliability. He raised a hand in greeting, not waving, just acknowledging, just waiting. Vernon opened the car door, stepped out onto the driveway, felt the solid ground beneath his worn loafers. The man on the porch walked down the steps and crossed the lawn, stopped directly in front of Vernon, extended his hand. Captain Caulfield, he said. I am David. Welcome home, sir. Vernon took the offer hand, felt the firm grip, saw the respect in the younger man's eyes. Thank you, Vernon said, for taking care of my daughter, for giving her the life I could not give her. David shook his head. She gave me the life, sir. I am just grateful she let me share it. Behind them, the front door opened again. 2 small figures appeared in the doorway. A girl in pink pajamas, a boy in footy sleepers decorated with airplanes. Emma stepped onto the porch first. Her eyes found Vernon, studied him with the unfiltered honesty of a 7-year-old. Are you my grandpa? She asked. The one who flew the fighter jets? Vernon's heart cracked open. Yes, he whispered. I am your grandpa, and I am so very glad to finally meet you. Emma smiled, grabbed her brother's hand. Together, they ran across the lawn and threw their arms around Vernon's legs, holding on with the fierce grip of children who had been waiting their entire lives for this moment. Vernon sank down to his knees on the cold grass, wrapped his arms around his grandchildren, felt their warmth against his chest, smelled the clean scent of their hair. And for the first time in 3 years, Vernon Caulfield was home. 3 months later, Vernon stood in the center of the Hartwell Aviation Heritage Museum, surrounded by a crowd that stretched from the entrance doors to the far walls of the hangar. The F-4 Phantom gleamed behind him, freshly polished, her gray skin catching the afternoon light streaming through the skylights. He wore his dress blues for the first time in nearly 30 years. Rebecca had found them in a storage unit in San Antonio, preserved in garment bags alongside Eleanor's wedding dress and boxes of photographs from a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. The uniform still fit, though it hung looser on his frame than it once had. The ribbons on his chest told a story that most people in the room were only beginning to understand. General Webb stood at a podium nearby, reading from a prepared statement. The words washed over Vernon without fully registering. Something about heroism, something about sacrifice, something about a nation's gratitude. Vernon was not listening to the words. He was watching his granddaughter Emma, who sat in the front row between Rebecca and David, her eyes wide with wonder as she stared at the aircraft behind him. Jacob sat on David's lap, clutching a toy F-4 Phantom that Vernon had helped him build from a model kit 2 weeks ago. The boy had insisted on painting it the exact shade of gray as the real thing. The past 3 months had not been easy. Vernon still woke screaming some nights, still found himself standing at the window at 3 in the morning, still sometimes forgot where he was and reached for a flight stick that was not there. But Rebecca had been right. Healing did not happen alone. It happened in the small moments. Breakfast with his grandchildren, evening walks with his daughter, long conversations with David about everything and nothing. It happened when Emma asked him to tell her a story about the Jets, and he found himself talking about Tommy for the first time in decades. Not about how Tommy died, about how Tommy lived. The jokes he told, the way he laughed, the photograph of the ultrasound taped to his instrument panel. It happened when he finally called Sarah Kerrigan, Tommy's widow, and spoke to her for 3 hours about the man they had both loved. She was 81 now, living in a retirement community in Florida. She had never remarried. She told Vernon that she had forgiven him decades ago, that she had never blamed him, that Tommy would have been proud of everything Vernon had accomplished. It happened when Michael Kerrigan, Tommy's son, flew in from Nevada to meet the man who had been his father's wingman. Michael was 52 now, retired from the Air Force, teaching aviation history at the University of Nevada. He had his father's grin, his father's laugh, his father's way of making everyone around him feel like they mattered. "I always knew you were out there," Michael had said when they shook hands. "My mother told me about you. She said you were the best friend my father ever had. She said you carried him with you everywhere you went." Vernon had shown Michael the dog tags, had told him the story of December 22nd, 1972, had finally, after 52 years, passed Tommy's tags to his son. "He would have wanted you to have these," Vernon had said. "He would have wanted you to know how much he loved you, even before you were born. He loved you more than anything in the world." Michael had wept. Vernon had wept with him, and something that had been broken for half a century had finally begun to mend. Now, standing in the museum with the ceremony swirling around him, Vernon felt the weight of those 52 years pressing down on his shoulders. But it was a different weight than before. Not crushing, not suffocating, something closer to gravity. Something that reminded him he was still connected to the earth. Webb finished his remarks and turned to Vernon. "Captain Caulfield," he said, "on behalf of a grateful nation, it is my honor to present you with this formal recognition of your service." Vernon stepped forward, accepted the framed certificate, shook Webb's hand, posed for photographs that would appear in newspapers across the country by tomorrow morning. Clara Mendez stood near the back of the crowd, her notepad filled with observations, her article already half-written in her head. The story of Vernon Caulfield had gone viral within hours of that October night. By morning, it had been picked up by national news outlets. By the end of the week, it had been viewed more than 50 million times. Preston Whitmore had issued a formal apology 3 days after the incident. It had been stilted and awkward, clearly written by lawyers, but Vernon had accepted it without hesitation. He had even reached out to the young man privately, offering to meet for coffee. Preston had declined at first, too ashamed to face him. But eventually, he had agreed. They had talked for 2 hours in a quiet diner outside of town. Preston had cried, had admitted that he had spent his entire life trying to impress people who did not matter, had confessed that mocking Vernon had made him feel powerful for a moment, and that the shame of that moment would stay with him forever. Vernon had listened, had nodded, had told Preston about the times he had failed, the times he had run away, the times he had let his own pain blind him to the pain of others. "We are all broken in different ways," Vernon had said. "The question is what we do with our brokenness. Do we let it make us cruel, or do we let it teach us compassion?" Preston had not answered, but something in his eyes had shifted. Something had cracked open that might, with time, become wisdom. The ceremony concluded with a flyover. 4 F-15 Eagles in missing man formation, screaming across the sky above the museum. One peeling away and climbing toward the heavens in tribute to the fallen. Vern watched them go, felt the rumble in his chest, remembered what it felt like to punch through the clouds and leave the earth behind. Beside him, Emma tugged at his sleeve. "Grandpa," she said, "will you teach me to fly someday?" Vernon looked down at his granddaughter, saw Eleanor's eyes looking back at him, saw the future stretching out ahead, filled with possibilities he had never imagined. "Yes," he said, When you are old enough, I will teach you everything I know." Emma grinned, slipped her hand into his. They stood together in the shadow of the F-4 Phantom, grandfather and granddaughter, watching the jets disappear into the endless blue sky. "Still here, Tommy," Vernon whispered. "Still flying." And for the first time in 52 years, he finally believed it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in the most unexpected forms, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and look around your own life today. The quiet person you pass on the street, the elderly neighbor you have never spoken to, the stranger who seems worn down by life. Everyone has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you from all of us for watching until the end.